the last mitzvah we were looking at was this number 149, and we're going to move on from it, but I want to read it just one more time. That is that he commanded us to check for the signs of beasts and animals that can be slaughtered, and that is that they chew the cud and have split hooves, and it is then permissible to eat them. And in that we are commanded to check them for these signs. It is a positive commandment, and that is his, God's, may he be blessed, saying, these are the animals that you may eat. And the language of the Sifra, which is again halachic midrash, is such may you eat. It may be, and that's the language that keys us into the fact that this is a positive commandment. And then somehow we got to mitzvah 136 because I clicked on something. And in that we are commanded to check them for the signs as a positive commandment. That is what we were saying. These are the animals that you may eat. And the language of the Sifra, such may you eat. It may be eaten, but an unclean beast may not be eaten. This means to say a beast that has these signs is permissible to eat. So it indicates that a beast that does not have these signs is not permissible to eat. And this is a negative commandment that is derived from a positive commandment. So it starts off by saying, these are the ones you can eat. And then it says, these are the ones you cannot eat. So again, according to the Rambam, according to Maimonides, checking to be certain that the animal that you are going to eat is in fact one of the kosher species is a positive commandment. And then eating ones that do not have these signs is a negative commandment. So we have a negative commandment that is derived from a positive commandment, which is a positive commandment as the principle does. And therefore, it's said after the statement, this tells me only of a positive commandment, for where do we know that he also transgresses a negative commandment? Hence, we learn to say the camel, etc., in Leviticus 11:4. As I will explain in the negative commandments, behold, it has already been made clear that his saying, such may you eat, is a positive commandment. And the content of the commandment is that we're commanded to check for these signs in the beasts and animals. It is not permissible to eat them without this. And this law is the commandment, and the regulations of this commandment have already been explained in Tractate Chulin and Bechoros. So again, it's not his mission in the book of mitzvos to actually go through the details. His primary purpose is to tell us what are, in this case, the positive commandments that are part of the 613. And whenever he brings these other things from the Midrash, etc., it's usually just to show us how he determined that this should be one of the positive commandments that are being counted. So when we were looking at it before, we saw in the commentaries that they sort of singled out the Rambam as one who holds that actually checking for these signs is a mitzvah. The Nachmanides, the Ramban, who writes a critique on this book, he doesn't think it should be counted as part of the 613 because he doesn't think it's an actual mitzvah to check for these indications that it's a kosher animal. If you end up eating something that didn't have these signs, then you transgress the positive commandment. But not that you're actually fulfilling a mitzvah by checking for these signs. But it does seem, according to the Rambam, that you are fulfilling a mitzvah by checking for these signs. And that's why in the last couple times we were looking at this, I was suggesting it would be sort of interesting to know when who is the person who actually fulfills this mitzvah? And let's say you're thinking of the chain of people involved at the slaughterhouse. So before it ever gets to the slaughterhouse, there's somebody who bought these animals. Now, this guy who bought the animals has to make sure that he's buying the right animals. So he's going to make sure he bought cattle, right? And so that guy in that position, for me, is the most likely candidate to fulfill this mitzvah, because he has to determine that he's actually, that in what is going to be the chain of responsibility for this animal, once it gets to the slaughterhouse, he is ensuring that it is in fact a kosher animal that's getting to the slaughterhouse. So it could be cattle or sheep or goats or chickens. Let's say who's ever the original buyer. Then the question becomes, let's say the shochet himself, who is not entirely relying on that first guy. He also is making sure that it's the right kind of animal. So the shochet himself may also fulfill this mitzvah. And then we saw also at these slaughterhouses, there's not just a shochet, there's somebody called a bodek who checks to make sure that in the end, this animal was not a treifa, to make, oftentimes it's people who are also shochtim, who they sort of switch off apparently in these slaughterhouses. So he's more looking to see if the insides are okay. He's not necessarily looking at hooves or whether the animal's chewing the cuds. He may be too far along in this process to be the guy who fulfills this mitzvah, unless you extend the mitzvah to be just making sure the animal is kosher. Because if that's part of the mitzvah, in other words, the hoofs and the chewing the cud are examples, but that the mitzvah is really just to make sure the animal is kosher to eat, then all these people in this chain could be fulfilling that mitzvah. And even I was suggesting it's possible that even the person who then, let's say, buys ground beef at the store and is checking for the kosher sign, it's possible by extension that he is fulfilling the mitzvah, if you interpret it in its broadest possible meaning. Also, there were commentaries who suggested that part of this mitzvah is being informed, so that you can check to make sure that the animal is kosher. So even studying might be part of the mitzvah. It may be preparation for the mitzvah, or it might be somehow accomplishing the mitzvah itself. And then that's when I was extending it to going to let's say you go to a petting zoo. So when you're at a petting zoo, there's difference between reading about something and then actually seeing it. I had a teacher whose name was Rabbi Meltzer, and Rabbi Meltzer told us the story that his father was a butcher, and so when he got smicha, Rabbi Meltzer got smicha. Right after he got smicha, his father came home with a piece of meat in a brown paper wrapping, and he opened up the brown paper wrapping and he put the meat in front of Rabbi Meltzer, and he said, "Kosher or treif? Is this meat kosher or treif?" And he didn't. And he said, "What is this?" He didn't even know what part of the cow it was. It ends up it was the stomach of the cow that his father brought home. So he always called it the holy stomach, or in Aramaic it's a combination of Yiddish and Aramaic, the heilige kurkabon, the holy stomach. Anyways, so there's a difference between reading about it, the book learning that's required, and then the actual physical, encountering the real thing. So I was just suggesting, is it possible when you go to a petting zoo and you get a chance to see cows and sheep and goats up close, is getting a good look at hooves and what does a split hoof mean, maybe, or outward indications that an animal chews its cud. Would those also could you be fulfilling the mitzvah by going to a petting zoo? So I did ask that of Mordechai Becher, and we're going to have to wait a little bit. Mordechai's two of his sons, Pinchas and Aryeh, are right now serving in the Israeli army. His son Aryeh had finished army service not terribly long ago, and had just landed what Mordechai said was his dream job after a lot of work to get it. And he served notice to his new employers that he has to quit because he's flying off to Israel, which he did. And so his two sons are now serving. And Mordechai told me that he just can't think too deeply right now while his sons are serving. So this is not a question that's necessarily in his automatic wheelhouse where he would have a ready answer for it. So we're going to have to wait for him to get back to us on that. So that was the animals. And then we have the birds. That is that he commanded us to check for the signs of birds such that only some of them are permissible. And the signs of the birds are not stated in the Torah. So what the Torah lists, I believe, 14 birds that are not kosher. The implication is that there are only 14 birds that are not kosher. That does not mean that you'd want to eat, just any bird, but there are only 14 that are not kosher. The problem is we have lost the tradition as to what some of these birds are. So there are some birds like the nesher, for instance. If you look at almost every translation of the nesher, you will see eagle. Almost every translation is eagle. But I've seen in some modern day explorations of this that they suggest that it is in fact more likely the griffin vulture. So all those times when it writes about nesher and that God took us out on the wings of eagles, etc., it's possible that it doesn't mean the eagle as we know the eagle. I imagine the bald eagle, being from the United States. It's possible it means the griffin vulture. So that's just one example. We have this kind of example trying to identify the terms in the Torah. We have this also with the hare or the rabbit. So one of the examples in the Torah, it's not a bird, but it's a similar problem. One of the examples in the Torah of a non-kosher species that has one of the indications of a kosher species, they list the hare. The hare does not have split hooves, but the hare, the Torah says, chews its cud. If you look at translations of the Hebrew word, which I believe is shafan, you'll see almost everybody has translated it as hare. Even the commentaries have identified it as the hare or the rabbit. The problem is that the hare or rabbit doesn't actually chew its cud. It does something similar. It re-chews and chews and chews material that it's eaten, but it doesn't have different stomachs that actually are processing the food and then regurgitate and then send it back down, chew it and then send it back down, regurgitate, send it back down, which is what chewing its cud really is. What happens with the hare or the rabbit is that the material it like spits out the material and then rechews it, and spits out the material and rechews it. So it's not actually chewing its cud. And this has created, all sorts of commentaries in contemporary times have wondered what the Torah means by saying it chews its cud when it doesn't chew its cud. So Natan Slifkin has several articles about this. He may even have a book called The Hare and the Hyrax, or it may be just the name of articles of his. But he suggested that it's not the hare, but it's actually a hyrax. If you go to En-Gedi, they actually have hyrexes. You can actually see them at En-Gedi. It's one of the common features, the common creatures that's around in the nature preserve of En-Gedi. And so he argues that it's the hyrax, which in fact does chew its cud, and it's not a hare. One of the problems with that is even early commentaries going back, many hundreds of years have already identified it with the hare or rabbit. But anyways, so that's another example of an animal that is mentioned in the Torah that has, there's some question about the identification today. Another famous one is the deer. The Hebrew word tzvi, which comes up all over in the Torah, the Hebrew word tzvi is almost always translated as deer. And again, early commentaries have already identified it as a deer. Rav Saadia Gaon, I believe, did not. He identified it as the gazelle, and modern commentaries are pretty much, they've leaned towards gazelle as a better translation for deer. But again, you have this issue that early commentaries said it was a deer, and now you have later commentaries that are suggesting that it's more likely the gazelle. There, you're better off because you have Rav Saadia Gaon himself, who's I think you could rely on. He's writing before many of those other commentaries, so at least you could sort of lean into his translation. But again, you see this happening with the animals. With the birds, it's worse. The actual tradition of what the non-kosher birds is worse. The Talmud does identify indications of a non-kosher bird from some of the examples that are given, and therefore it does actually offer what are signs. And this is when the Rambam says, well, thank you, Mo, for that link. Maybe we'll go to that link at some point. But anyways, the Rambam, if you'll notice at the beginning of this, the Rambam says that he commanded us to check for the signs of birds. So the Rambam is suggesting there are signs you can rely on, not just a tradition as to the meaning, to who these birds are. Or to what these birds are. But then he makes that point. The signs of the birds are not stated in the Torah. There are signs, but they're not stated in the Torah. Where would they be stated? They would be stated in the Talmud. But this is a little bit different tack. You're relying on signs as opposed to the tradition as to what the birds, who these birds are that are not kosher. So obviously this would be a good fallback if there were in fact signs that we could rely on. When you look at what people eat today, there's been some interesting articles. There were some articles in Jewish Action. There were several of these scholar kind of hobbyists that made it their business to try to find which birds different communities are comfortable with, because different communities, let's say we live in North America, there's certain birds we don't commonly see them. Also, if you lived in the Middle East, there's certain birds would not be as common. For instance, the turkey is one of those birds that gets a lot of write-up because clearly they did not have the turkey in the Middle East. The turkey is indigenous to the Americas. So it's very unlikely that anybody would have a tradition about the turkey. Again, the turkey might have signs that indicate it's kosher, but again, originally you're not relying on signs. You're just relying on these 14 are no good. How do you know the turkey wasn't among those 14? So what had been common early, and it's still very much relied on today, is that if there's a tradition it's kosher, you can eat it. If there's not a tradition that it's kosher, you can't eat it. So if you're saying that if there's not a tradition that it's kosher, you can't eat it, how can we eat the turkey? There's no way they had a tradition that the turkey was kosher. They didn't have turkeys at that time. How would they ever develop a tradition that it's kosher? Even when turkeys get to Europe, they're getting to Europe after European exploration of the Americas. So you're talking about, 500-600 years ago that Europe is first seeing turkeys. And that's way late for the kind of traditions we're talking. We're talking about stuff that goes back to biblical times. You'd need a tradition. So
what about if you take the notion of some sort of criterion, like one of the things that they did use, especially with turkeys, birds of a feather flock together. And if they can mate and things like that, this may be the thing, the association, but it has to trace back to the original 14 or whatever it is.
Right. So again, we're in a certain way lucky that the 14 are the ones you can't eat and not the 14 you can. Because if it was the 14 you can, then this would not work, what you're describing. But it is what, in the end, it is probably the most prominent feature that we're relying on, is that we do have traditions about other birds that are very similar to the turkey, and they're so similar that people are confident that they're part of this larger family, and therefore that they're almost like we'll call it grandfathered in, or not grandfathered in, but they're cousined in. In other words, that that people just feel comfortable enough about them to say that they must be kosher, just because they are part of a broader family of birds where we have several traditions that they are kosher. But there were people, I think there still are some very small group, that do not eat turkey. There were certainly people, especially when a lot of Europeans, Rabbanim, were coming to America, who were still grappling with this issue. And you'll see learned articles in a lot of publications where they focus on the turkey. One of the best ones is an article by the Atlanta Scholars Kollel. They had a publication, I think it was called Torah from Dixie. And they devoted, I think it was Michael Brody who actually wrote the article, but they published it as part of Torah from Dixie. He was, I think he still is, a professor at Emory, and he writes on a lot of halachic topics. He's an excellent writer. So he devotes a good amount of time to this subject. He also talks about trick-or-treating, whether it would be halachically permissible for a Jew to trick-or-treat, which requires going back to the origins of Halloween, but also the origins of the custom of trick-or-treating. Because apparently, although Halloween is celebrated by people all around the world, trick-or-treating is not as common a practice. So anyway, so he has a whole thing devoted to that, whether you can trick-or-treat. But because they both come around the same time, Halloween and Thanksgiving, and many Jews want to participate in Thanksgiving, so this subject came up. Again, almost everybody nowadays, and when I say everybody, I mean, as far as I know, this again is just my own survey, from my own sort of experience in talking about this subject with different people, is that whether you're amongst the Jews who are devoted to tradition, whatever their group is, most of their group tend to eat turkey. Again, there are holdouts, there are people that are still concerned. And Ramosha Shapiro, blessed memory, on several occasions told us that he had a friend in yeshiva who had, they were from German Jewish stock, and they had a family tradition on particular Shabbos to eat a particular bird so that they could preserve the tradition about these birds. There is some disagreement between Manny Nissel and I. I think Manny Nissel is right now, Rabbi Nissel is doing, I think he's very close to publishing a book about Ramosha Shapiro, through the memories and eyes of his students. And so we both agree that he had this friend who had these traditions, but how many Shabboses they had, that was some question. I seem to remember a larger number than he does, but he's been doing the research, and my memory is incredibly flawed. But anyways, they actually had these different, each week they would eat a different, for I don't know how many weeks, but they had special Shabboses where they'd have like this kind of pigeon Shabbos and this kind of goose, Shabbos, and etc., so that they could preserve the tradition. And that's typically what you hear people doing. You do not hear people relying on outward indications, except for the turkey one. But otherwise, you don't really hear it so much. I know Natan Slifkin just had one of those dinners in Israel where they ate exotic animals, just to sort of familiarize the broader public with what kind of things are kosher and what kind of things are not kosher. They tried to eat a kind of wide variety of animals and birds that you wouldn't typically find on a menu, just for this purpose, to sort of educate people. And so he's, very in touch with these other guys who do these investigations. He himself does these kinds of investigations. And so this is very much a subject that he is fascinated by and writes a lot about. But I guess, so that is one of the most interesting things to me about how the Rambam is writing this, that he begins with this notion of checking for the signs of birds, even though when you read the literature and you see how people today are going about deciding what to eat, the checking for signs is not what you see. You do not see that happening too much, again, except for that discussion of figuring out if the turkey is kosher. But otherwise, it seems to be all about what is there a tradition or what to do. Another area where the tradition comes up is about eating grasshoppers or locusts. There are kosher locusts or grasshoppers, but Ashkenazim have not been eating them for hundreds of years. And so Ashkenazim do not have a tradition when it comes to them. And therefore, Ashkenazim don't tend to eat them. Yemenites and Moroccans do have traditions about which ones can be eaten and which ones can't, and they do eat them. And so this is another issue that comes up. Let's say I'm an Ashkenazi Jew and I don't have a tradition, but a Moroccan Jew does. Shouldn't that be counted as a tradition for me too? Jews have a tradition. What difference does it make if it's Moroccan Jews that have it as opposed to German Jews? But somehow there are people that are holding fast on this and are very uncomfortable. Natan Slifkin actually markets some kosher grasshoppers. And I remember there was a locust infestation that came from Africa into southern Israel. And he harvested, a lot of them and, identified them as kosher according, I don't remember whose specific tradition, Moroccans or Yemenites or maybe Libyans or so. But North Africans seem to all have had these traditions besides Yemen. And so he markets them and sells them. But I know that there were Ashkenazim. And I remember they did one of these dinners at Shalit's in Chicago. And they didn't, in the end, they didn't serve them because there was still this sort of Ashkenazi stubbornness not to eat them based on the other traditions. And again, I don't have clarity on what is a tradition, and if somebody does have a tradition, does it cross over to the broader community? Like, for instance, those guys who were looking to identify certain types of pigeons, they found a shoichet in Tzfat who was shechting this certain kind of was it a pigeon or some kind of, I think it was a kind of pigeon or quail or something, but a specific type, a specific kind. And they found this shoichet in Tzfat who was shechting them, and he had the tradition, and for some reason that is okay. Then that became, the Jews have a tradition about this and it's kosher. So exactly what happens with that. But it's, again, all of this because he starts off by talking about the signs, and in the Hebrew, simanim, which is, again, he wrote this in Arabic, not in Hebrew, but he was alive when they were translating this, and he saw the translation, so we'll assume he was happy with it. Okay. The signs of the birds are not stated in the Torah. They rather come from an investigation of our finding the birds that are written to be forbidden, and are then finding phenomena that they have in common. And these are the signs of an impure bird. And then they'll say, that they have a certain way of holding their prey. They bring the prey to their mouth. There's certain other indications that it would be a non-kosher bird. And since also regarding birds, are we involved with the issue of which is impure and which is pure, in other words, kosher and not kosher, the involvement is a positive commandment. So determining that that particular bird is kosher would be a positive commandment. That's what he's saying. Even though if you look at the language, most of the emphasis on which ones are not kosher, but still, at some point, the language of the Sifri is you may eat any clean bird. That is a positive commandment. Behold, what we have hinted was made clear, and the regulations of this commandment have already been explained in Chulin. And then the next one is grasshoppers. That is, command us to check for the signs of locusts as well. And the signs are written in the Torah that have above their feet joined legs. And in other words, some of the signs. But again, at some point, it became unclear what some of these signs mean. At least that's how Ashkenazim view it. And therefore, you need to rely on tradition. And the content of this commandment is like that which you explained in the commandment before. And the verse says about this, saying, of these you may eat. That's positive language following locusts. The laws of this commandment have already been explained in Tractate Chulin. So what he's done, let's just finish the last one. You know what? The last one we'll do tomorrow, because he comes back and sort of includes a little bit of a review. This next one is going to be about fish. And also, Mo, if you would text me that link, maybe we'll look at that. I'll look at that and see if we could also see that tomorrow.
Okay.
All right. thank you guys. I'm very grateful to have learned with you. Our learning today was in the merit of the speedy, healthy return of the hostages, the healing for the wounded, the comforting of the bereaved, the safety of our soldiers, and the safety of all the people living in the region, and the safety of all of us. And everything should come to a peaceful.
Amen.
Peace soon.
Yes.
Okay. All right, guys.
Thank you,
Thank you
Rabbi.
so much. It was an honor to learn with you. I'm grateful.
Thank you.
You.
Bye-bye.